Chapter 2. The Heavenly Host in Service to God. As noted in the last chapter, the label angel is just a job description, a particular service rendered on God's behalf by certain members of the heavenly host. The same is true of cherubim and seraphim, both of which describe guardianship of the divine presence. But there is more to what angels and other members of the heavenly host do in God's service than these terms convey. An accurate understanding of how the members of the heavenly host serve God must derive from the biblical text. Our goal is to build upon our earlier survey of relevant terms, beginning with some general observations about the abilities of members of the heavenly host. Shared abilities for service. The biblical vocabulary makes it clear that the members of the heavenly host are by nature unembodied spirit beings. Their normative domain is the spiritual world. They were present with God before the creation of the world and human beings. This otherness raises questions for many Bible readers. First, are the members of the heavenly host eternal? Second, are they impersonal forces or persons? In other words, do they have personality? Third, what attributes and limitations do they possess? Fourth, do they have free will, or are they spiritual robots? The first question is the easiest to answer. In biblical theology, there is only one spirit being who is eternal, having no beginning and no end, never described as being created, whose existence preceded creation and is therefore from everlasting to everlasting. All other Elohim were created by the lone uncreated God of the Bible. Note: Yahweh of Israel is singled out as unique among all Elohim in other ways. Yahweh alone is all-powerful, the sovereign king over the all that he has made, including other Elohim. Yahweh, therefore, is the only Elohim who deserves worship from his creations. In fact, Nehemiah 9:6 specifically declares that Yahweh is unique. There is only one Yahweh. You are the Lord, Yahweh, you alone. End note. He is the creator of the other members of his host council. Since the members of the host of heaven are identified with the stars, or called stars, passages that describe the creation of the heavens with all their host speak to the belief of the biblical writers that everything in the heavens came to be from God alone. Consequently, the members of the heavenly host aren't eternal, since they had a beginning. Note: eternal is not synonymous with everlasting. The latter speaks of something having no end, not something having no beginning. An eternal being has no beginning and no end. End note. The members of the heavenly host also aren't everlasting or immortal, at least in terms of their unchangeable intrinsic attributes. Their immortality is dependent on God's will. Psalm 82, 6-7 is explicit proof of this limitation. The Elohim spirit beings in rebellion against God will have their existence terminated in God's own time and at God's discretion. These beings are God's, Elohim, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die, and fall like any prince. The theological point is transparent. God is the single being whose existence is entirely under his own control. No other being can take it away. That is not true of other spirit beings. As created beings, the members of the heavenly host, therefore, are not exhaustive attribute replicas of God. They have inherent limitations in many respects in comparison to God. Like human beings, whatever the Elohim of the heavenly host are, they are less than God. And what they are, and what we are, is contingent upon God's own decision to create them and share his attributes with them. This connection to humanity is not a mere convenience. The idea is scriptural, deriving from the plural language of Genesis 1:26. And God said, "Let us create humankind in our image and according to our likeness." In the unseen realm, I devote a good deal of space to discussing the exegetical basis for this passage being an announcement by God to the members of his council, and not an oblique reference to the Trinity, and for interpreting the passage as a representation of God, not as a specific attribute given to humans or the members of God's council. Note: not only is there no exegetical basis to restrict the plural group addressed by God to two other persons, but sound biblical theology requires us to assert that all members of the Trinity are co-equal in all attributes. Consequently, God would have no need to announce or inform the other members of a Trinity that he intended to create humanity. They would already know that, or they would not be equally omniscient. Appeal to Jesus' inability to know certain things, for example, Matthew 24:36, as the second person of the Trinity to explain presumed Trinitarian ignorance in Genesis 1:26, fails coherence, as this limitation is of necessity linked to incarnation. The incarnation is not in play in Genesis 1:26. End note. The plural language links God both to us and to the members of the council to whom he is speaking. Note: this connection is also evident when one compares Genesis 3:5, "For God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, Elohim, knowing good and evil," with Genesis 3:22, "Then the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil." The phrase, "like one of us," clearly informs us that we ought to read Elohim in verse 5 as a plural, "You will be like gods." In both verses, the following participle, knowing, is grammatically plural. As I discuss in The Unseen Realm, both humans and the members of God's divine host share God's attribute of intelligence and freedom to choose. However, until humanity made a willing, conscious decision to obey God, that is, act autonomously, they had no knowledge of rebellion. End note. They, like us, are reflections of their Creator. Humans and intelligent spirit beings are representatives of God in their respective domains. Other scholars have taken note of this connection and its implications. For example, Patrick D. Miller observes, "Let us make mankind in our image after our likeness." While other interpretations are possible, the most plausible understanding of these first-person plural verbs and suffixes is that God's words are a directive to the divine council. At the point in the text where the narrative speaks of a close relation between the divine world and the human world, and suggests that the human partakes of the divine in some fashion, it refers not simply to the deity, but to the whole divine world, the divine beings. A human is both a consequence of Yahweh's decision in and to the council, and a reflection of the divine world as it is embodied in the heavenly assembly. The Ben Adim, son of man, human one, is like the Ben Elim, son of God, divine one, a notion expressed explicitly also in Psalm 8. The creation of the human creature is the establishment of a representative from the divine world to rule the created order. The image of the divine ones is placed on earth to embody and represent the divine ones in subduing, ruling, and governing the earth. The creation of male and female provides for the sustaining of that rule in the perpetuation of the creation. Note: not only does seeing the Trinity in Genesis 1:26 ignore the grammar and syntax of the passage, but it means reading the New Testament back into the Old Testament. The result is an interpretation foreign to the thinking of the original writer and his readers. The plural of majesty is also not an option. As Yuan and Murioka note, the we of majesty does not exist in Hebrew. The point here is that the plural of majesty does exist for nouns. The plurality of Genesis 1:26 does not derive from the nouns. The issue is the verbal forms. End note. The implication of this connection is that if we desire to know what the members of the heavenly host are like, we should consider ourselves analogous. Psalm 8:5, the passage cited by Miller, informs us that God has made us a little lower than the heavenly beings, Elohim. Note: Hebrews 2:7 has a little lower than angels, angelos. See the discussion of New Testament terminology for why the writer of Hebrews translates Elohim with angelos, Greek masculine accusative plural. Endnote. Yet God shared his attributes with us as he first did with them. What are members of the heavenly host like? They are like God, and like us. Think about these attributes that we share with our Creator: intelligence, creativity, emotions, rationality, and volition. Our fellow imagers, the members of the heavenly host, have them as well, because they are also his imagers. Our embodiment naturally means we live with significant limitations that unembodied intelligent beings don't. Because of what happened in Eden, our lifespans are severely curtailed. We die after a brief existence in the world God made for us. It is only at that point that we experience the presence of God, presuming we are part of his family through redemptive grace. We are thus far less intelligent, creative, and wise than the members of the spiritual world. We simply do not know what they have learned through access to God and lifespans of many eons. But what they are and know is part of our own destiny in Christ. Note, this destiny, to be like the stars, as it were, has deep Old Testament roots. The key passage is Genesis 15:5, that the offspring of Abraham would be like the stars. Paul quotes this passage in Romans 4:18 as part of his argument, which includes the statement that Abraham and his offspring would inherit the cosmos. Most Bible interpreters take the promise of Genesis 15:5 as a numerical one. This is certainly the case, but there is a noteworthy stream of Second Temple Jewish interpretation, culminating in the New Testament, that considers the promise qualitative as well. The point is that believers, the children of Abraham through faith in the promised messianic seed, would not only be as numerous as the stars, but would be made divine as stars. The members of the heavenly host were considered to be. Being made like the stars is part of the biblical theology of glorification, or theosis. Endnote. Free will is part of this attribute matrix. The interest in free will, as it relates to members of the heavenly host, arises from questions about how and when Satan turned against God, or whether angels still can, at some future time, rebel. There is no scriptural indication in either the Old or New Testament that the ability to rebel against God's authority was turned off at any time. Consequently, they can still conceivably fall. But one would suspect that, given the fate of divine rebels recounted in Scripture, those who remain faithful would be much less inclined toward rebellion. This brief foray into the attributes heavenly beings possess by virtue of their status as representatives of their Creator helps us to grasp what they do. Their service to God can be expressed in three broad categories: participation in God's heavenly counsel, obedience to God's decisions, and praise of the Most High. We will consider each with its respective aspects. Participation in God's heavenly counsel. Our discussion of Yahweh's divine counsel in the previous chapter made brief mention of counsel roles, mostly in regard to how the role messenger, malachim, angels, provided evidence for tiered authority in the council. Note, some recent work on demons by evangelical scholar John Walton requires some comment, as it potentially creates misunderstanding on the nature of the divine council and its tiered structuring. Walton's goal in his essay is to articulate a taxonomy of divine beings that allows alignment between the spiritual worldviews of Mesopotamia and Israel. Consequently, and unfortunately, he excludes civilizations like that of Egypt and ancient Canaan, in other words, Ugarit, from focus. Though Walton is clear that he is focusing on Mesopotamia, these exclusions are noteworthy. To make claims about Israel's divine council as Walton does without appeal to Ugaritic material, which all scholars in the field note constitutes the closest parallels to the Israelite divine council, will produce statements that can be misconstrued. For example, Walton's taxonomic hierarchy, based on Mesopotamian analogies, includes several classes, the first two of which are gods, Class 1, defined as those who receive sacrifices, and functionaries, Class 2, where he assigns malachim, angels, cherubim, and seraphim. Walton believes there is no precedent for Class II spirits to be equated with the Class I members of the Divine Council, even after they are largely domesticated in later Mesopotamian literature. This statement could be confusing in that its wording suggests that angels, Malachim, a Class II term in his scheme, are not part of the Divine Council. Such a claim would, of course, be disputed by a number of studies on the Divine Council and the closer parallels to Israelite material from Ugarit. Elsewhere, Walton seems to understand the Divine Council as being comprised only of those entities in the spiritual world that have decision-making rank. This, again, violates the tight parallels between the terminology of the Hebrew Bible and Ugaritic material. The problem is a semantic one. The Divine Council need not necessarily be conceptually restricted to decision-makers. Indeed, the analogy of human government in civilizations that had a conception of a Divine Council makes the point clear. Not all members of a king's government would be directly involved in decision-making. There are layers of advisors who have input, but these governments had service staff or lesser bureaucrats who were nevertheless part of the king's administration. Perhaps a modern analogy of government in the United States will help make the point. We can speak of the federal legislature, by which we mean the branch of government responsible for passing laws. The term Congress is a synonym. However, our Congress has two parts, the Senate and the House. Decision-making members of these two bodies, and hence the Congress, are elected. The House and Senate both have service staff, in other words, guardian officers like the sergeant-at-arms. Though they have no decision-making power, they are nevertheless part of Congress in certain contexts where that term is used. For example, saying that Congress was not in session does not mean that all the service staff were given the day off. Congress can therefore refer to only those elected officials who make laws, or to the entire bureaucratic apparatus of the federal legislature. As we will see in this discussion, the heavenly bureaucracy, council, is layered, and its members serve God in different but related ways. Endnote. Council members do more than just run the heavenly mailroom. They engage with God as a functioning bureaucracy, a role nuanced in three ways. 1. Contributing to council resolutions. We looked briefly at 1 Kings 22:19-23 in the previous chapter. Our goal then was to establish that the members of Yahweh's host were spirit beings. There is more to observe in the passage. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him, on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth-Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, By what means? And he said, I will go out, and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out, and do so. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. This glimpse into a heavenly council meeting is framed by the wickedness of King Ahab of Israel. It is clear from verse 20 that God has decided that it is time for Ahab to die. The members of the host of heaven are described as standing, Hebrew, amad, in attendance to the seated king judge. This language is stock vocabulary for attending to a superior. Standing in this setting is not a passive act. Rather, the posture speaks of being available, ready, and willing to carry out the superior's commands. Martins summarizes the idea. A more technical and somewhat idiomatic use of the verb amad relates to government, especially royalty, before whom persons stand as messengers or ministers prepared to take directives. As for God, king over all, he can deploy prophets, priests, and others who stand before Yahweh as his messengers. True prophets, for example, are privy to the decisions made in the divine council where they stand. Elijah introduced himself as the prophet of Yahweh, before whom I stand. God raises up prophets to serve him, stand before him. Priests, Levites especially, are acknowledged ministers before the Lord, who perform their service, amud. In the heavenly courts, hosts are at God's right and left hand. To be in God's service is a high honor. When the council meeting commences, God asks the spirit beings present how Ahab's death should be accomplished. God had decreed Ahab was going to die at Ramoth-Gilead, but he allows debate and participation when it comes to the means of Ahab's demise. One of the spirit beings proposes a plan. I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. God approves, knowing full well that the plan will succeed. Had the omniscient God of Israel known the proposition would fail, he would have heard another one or proceeded on his own account. The text presents us with a clear instance where God has sovereignly decided to act, but allows his lesser, intelligent servants to participate in how his decision is carried out. God wasn't searching for ideas as though he couldn't conceive of a plan. He allowed those who serve him the latitude to propose options. In other words, the members of the host were involved in the divine decree. As Miller has observed, the symbol of the divine council is a quite concrete, if multifaceted one. Yahweh is seen as seated upon his throne of kingship in a temple or palace surrounded by a nameless host of divine beings who are sometimes portrayed as present before or beside Yahweh, and elsewhere as coming in to take their position in the presence of Yahweh. The assembly, or members of it, whether the divine ones or the holy ones or particular groups within the whole, for example, the seraphim, are sometimes depicted as serving or worshipping the Lord, a part of the holy array that gives God glory. At other times, they converse among themselves, or the Lord converses with them, for example, in the prologue to the book of Job, and in the vision of Micaiah in 1 Kings 22:19-23. The Lord takes counsel with the council, commissions them with certain tasks. They sit as a court or governmental body in which the Lord judges a case or utters a decree. There is no hint that the suggestion of the spirit being to deceive Ahab was pre-programmed. God was also not bound to it. Had a member of the heavenly host proposed an idea God in his omniscience knew would not succeed, he could have vetoed it. The criterion was simple: will it succeed? The omniscient God knew the suggestion would succeed and approved it. The fact that God was seated in 1 Kings 22:19 is also of interest. While standing is the normative description for attendance, sitting can be presumed as the posture of the one rendering judgment. The Old Testament certainly utilizes this description in the context of rendering judgment, but there are also interesting exceptions in the divine council. Daniel 7:9-10 reads, As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. The seated Ancient of Days is obviously the leader of the council, but thrones are set in place for at least some members of the council. Note, multitudes of the host are also said to be standing. The plural thrones are not, as Jewish tradition wants to argue, for the Messianic Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. While the latter is seated, at no point does the Son of Man sit. There is clearly a council in session and multiple thrones, not merely two and one unoccupied. End note. The council members occupying the other thrones are part of the decision-making process. This is quite evident from Daniel 9:26. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. The verdict on the fourth beast is connected to the court sitting in judgment. The seated council in Daniel 7:9-10 is therefore not just window dressing. In ancient Israelite thought, the party, or parties, seated in an assembled meeting had decision-making authority. Note, some scholars have used Old Testament standing vocabulary to Psalm 82 to argue that the psalm is proof of Israelite polytheism. The argument can be summarized as follows. The God, Elohim, who stands, Nitzab, in the divine council, El, is not the Most High, El Elyon, of verse 6. Elyon was, so the argument goes, an epithet of El, and so the deity of 82:1, bringing accusation, is not the one who ran the council. The unnamed deity of Psalm 82:1, who stands, is Yahweh. He is bringing accusation against the sons of the Most High, who are corrupt. The judge of the council is El Elyon. Consequently, Yahweh and El Elyon are not the same, and Israelite religion had a higher God than Yahweh. The argument is based on several assumptions. One, that Elyon is seated as judge in the council, and thus the standing Yahweh is acting as prosecutor in the divine council. 2, in legal settings, judges always sit. 3, Yahweh could not be both prosecutor and judge in the divine council. I have addressed this line of thinking and its presumed evidence in 2 articles. The data marshaled to create the picture is actually not consistent. God is depicted as standing to judge. Elsewhere, Yahweh is a seated judge, and so it is possible to see Yahweh as both the standing deity, Elohim, of 82:1, and the deity asked to rise up, which requires a seated position, in 82:8. The approach advocated here lets the text stand as it is, in the context of the wider Hebrew Bible. The biblical writers explicitly identify Yahweh and El. Why would someone read Psalm 82 in a way that avoids these other passages and this explicit identification? Well, the answer is that the idea of an evolution from polytheism to monotheism is presumed and brought to the passage. That is, texts are read through the filter of this assumption, not in the wider canonical context. The evolutionary presumption itself is based on circular reasoning. End note. The seated posture of the council expresses a participatory role, but the other details of 1 Kings 22:19-23 and Daniel 7:9-10 are equally significant. The council neither acts alone nor without a head. The members of the heavenly host partner with God in carrying out his will. They are not autonomous.